It was in the waning days of November 1886 when the wind first began to whisper of the trouble to come. At first, I thought it nothing more than the usual mutterings of the northern plains, that long, moaning breath that slid across the empty miles and ruffled the hair on man and beast alike. But the sky told a different story. Each dawn it seemed a shade paler, a little more brittle, as though the cold itself were beginning to gnaw at the heavens. I had seen winters enough to respect their cruelty, but there was something different in the air that year. Our homestead sat low in the rolling grasslands of Dakota Territory, far from the shelter of wooded hills or deep valleys. The land stretched out flat as a sleeping lake, broken only by the frozen ripples of last summer's plowing. My cattle grazed where they could, nosing through the crusted snow that had come early in light flurries. They were hardy beasts, accustomed to the season's sting, but I could sense their unease the way they lingered near the fences instead of ranging far, the restless flick of their ears toward the horizon, as if they, too, could hear the distant drumbeat of what was coming. The other ranchers and I met at the trading post one gray afternoon to share news, swap small supplies, and measure each other's readiness. The talk was uneasy. Jacob Steiner, who had seen 40 winters here, said he'd noticed the muskrats building their dens higher along the creek banks, a sure sign of heavier snows. Old Mrs. Conway swore her joints ached deeper than in years past, and she had never been wrong in her weather sense. Even the trader's wife, a stoic woman of few words, admitted she'd had dreams of white fields swallowing the sky. Still, life pressed on. We had work to do, fences to mend before the deep freeze set in, sheds to fortify, hay to stack high. My hands cracked and bled in the cold, the skin pulling tight over my knuckles. Each evening I would warm them by the stove, the orange light painting the cabin walls in soft, flickering waves. My wife, Anna, moved quietly through the rooms, her breath making little clouds when she leaned over the kettle. She did not speak of her fears, but I could read them in the way she pulled our children closer at night, tucking the quilts high under their chins as though the wind might slip in under the door and carry them away. By mid-December, the first true storm arrived. It came suddenly, without the long gray warning skies I had learned to trust. One morning the sun rose pale and thin over the frost-whitened fields. By noon the light was gone, swallowed by a wall of swirling white that rolled toward us like the tide. The wind hit first, a battering, unrelenting force that bent the bare cottonwoods like reeds. Snow followed in fierce horizontal sheets, each flake a needle against the skin. The cattle bawled in confusion, their bodies pressed into the drifts, eyes wide and rimmed with ice. We fought to drive them toward the shelter of the barn, but the wind stripped our voices from our throats. I could see my neighbor, Thomas, through the storm, only a shadow moving against a curtain of white as we struggled together to close the gates. My coat was stiff with ice, my breath freezing in my beard until it felt like iron against my skin. The drifts grew so quickly they seemed to swell upward from the earth itself, swallowing fence posts, creeping up the sides of the outbuildings. That night the cabin shuddered like a living thing beneath the onslaught. Snow hissed against the windows, wormed its way through every crack and seam. I sat by the stove with my rifle across my knees, though there was nothing to shoot, only the wild howl of the wind. Anna and the children huddled beneath the quilts, their faces pale in the dim light. Outside the cattle were silent now. I prayed they had found shelter enough to see the night through. By morning the world was unrecognizable. The horizon had vanished, replaced by a white, undulating waste. Fences were gone, buried deep. Even the barn roof wore a thick crown of snow. We dug our way out through the drift that blocked the door, the snow powder, fine and stinging as it blew into our faces. I made for the barn first. Inside the air was warmer, thick with the breath of animals. Some of the cattle had survived the night pressed together in the straw, their hides crusted with frost. Others had not. We dragged the frozen bodies out into the yard, a grim and silent duty. This was only the beginning. The storm lasted 3 days before the wind eased and the sun returned, pale but welcome. Yet the reprieve was brief. Each week seemed to bring another gale, another smothering of snow. The land was changing beneath our feet where once the prairie had been firm, familiar ground. It was now a treacherous expanse of ice and drift, the landmarks erased, travel became dangerous. More than one rancher lost in the white was not found until the thaw. The cold deepened as January came on. Nights were so bitter the very air seemed to freeze in my lungs. The cattle's breath hung around them like ghosts. Water buckets split in the cold, and the pump handle burned the skin if touched with bare hands. We chopped ice from the creek each morning, only to find it sealed again within hours. The hay stacks shrank faster than I had feared, for the cattle needed double rations to keep from starving in the deep freeze. One day I set out with Thomas to check the far pasture, a stretch we had not seen since before the first storm. We traveled on snowshoes, the drifts rising higher than a man's waist. It was slow going, the wind scouring our faces raw. When we reached the pasture, we found the remains of a dozen head, half buried in snow. Some had died standing, frozen in place where they'd been caught in the gale. Their eyes were white with frost, their bodies stiff and unyielding. We marked the spot in our minds, for there was no use hauling them now. It was on that return journey that the cold truly showed its teeth. The wind rose again, quick as the snap of a whip, bringing with it another wall of snow. We lost sight of the cabin's smoke within minutes. The horizon vanished, and the land seemed to tilt beneath us, every direction the same blinding white. My heart pounded as I realized how easily we could wander in circles, only to collapse in the drifts. But Thomas kept his head. He pulled me close and shouted, though I could barely hear him, to keep the wind at our right cheek. We moved like that for hours, stumbling, falling, rising again, until at last the dim outline of the barn loomed through the storm. That night, as I warmed my hands by the stove and listened to the wind batter the walls, I knew this winter was not like others I had endured. It had a hunger in it, a patient, grinding appetite that would strip the land bare and test every soul who dared to stand against it. And though I tried to bury the thought, I could not help but wonder if we would all see the spring. The new year arrived without celebration. We marked its passing only by the fact that another bitter week had ended and yet another had begun. There was no music, no clinking of glasses, no midnight cheer. The wind outside howled in the chimney like some ancient, mourning spirit, and the snow pressed against the windows as though it meant to enter. In the soft glow of the stove, Anna mended a tear in my heavy coat. Her fingers, reddened from the cold, moved slowly, carefully. She glanced up once, her eyes meeting mine, and in that look was the unspoken question, how much longer can we keep going like this? Each morning began in darkness. The sun did not so much rise as it merely lightened the sky from black to gray. I would pull on my boots, still stiff with frost despite their nearness to the stove, and wrap myself in layers until I could scarcely bend. The air inside the barn was sharp and heavy with the scent of damp hay and animal breath. Steam rose from the backs of the cattle, but their ribs were showing more now, the great muscles of summer and autumn wasting under the strain of this endless cold. Hay was vanishing faster than I could have imagined. Each pitchfork full was precious, measured out as though it were gold dust. Some days I caught myself thinking in dangerous terms, wondering which animals might be spared and which might not. But such thoughts had to be beaten back quickly. Once they took root, they would grow, and I could not bear the weight of that choice unless forced. The children were restless in the cabin. My eldest, Matthew, asked one afternoon why we could not go into town to visit the store. I tried to explain the danger, the way the road could vanish beneath snow, how the wind could blind a man in minutes, but I could see his disappointment. He missed the laughter of other children, the little treats the trader sometimes gave him. Instead, he and his sister, Clara, played in the small corner of the cabin near the stove, building towns from stacked firewood and straw. Anna would smile faintly at their games, though her eyes were far away, perhaps already counting how many more days the larder might hold. It was mid-January when Thomas came to the door, his beard frosted white, snow clinging to his shoulders. "We've got trouble," he said without greeting. I pulled on my coat and followed him out into the biting cold. The sky was a low ceiling of steel, and the air felt charged, as if holding its breath. We trudged toward his place, each step crunching over the packed drifts. When we reached his barn, I saw the problem: the roof had begun to sag under the weight of snow. If it gave way, he'd lose what shelter he had for his stock. We worked for hours in the numbing wind, shoveling snow from the roof, careful to spread our weight evenly. My fingers ached in my gloves, the cold biting down through wool and leather until it was almost unbearable. But we dared not stop. The animals' lives and Thomas's winter survival depended on it. At last we cleared enough weight to ease the strain. We stumbled down, our legs trembling from the effort, and stood together for a moment in the gray afternoon, catching our breath. That night, as I rubbed warmth back into my hands, I realized how fragile everything was now. A roof, a fence, a stack of hay each was a thin barrier between survival and loss. One bad night could undo years of labor. And the winter had not yet shown its full fury. Late that same week, a storm came like none before. The wind struck with such violence that the cabin walls moaned. Snow burst through every seam and crack, a fine, cutting powder that coated the floor near the door and windows. We stuffed rags into the gaps, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with one's hands. The air inside grew dim with blowing snow, the lantern light dulled and ghostly. Outside, I could hear the cattle lowing in distress, but there was no way to reach them. Opening the door, even for a moment, was impossible. The wind would drive the snow inside in choking clouds. I sat helpless by the stove, listening to the muffled thud of shifting drifts against the walls. The children clung to Anna, their faces pressed into her skirts. When morning came, it was as though the world had been buried. The drifts reached to the eaves in places, and the barn was entirely hidden from view. I dug for hours just to reach it, carving a narrow trench through the hard, packed snow. Inside, I found that 3 cattle had perished in the night, smothered by the cold or perhaps weakened beyond recovery. The rest stood silent and hollow-eyed, shifting on their hooves in the frozen straw. I felt a deep, leaden sorrow settle in my chest, the kind that does not flare and pass, but lingers, heavy and patient. A day later, we tried to break a trail toward town with the sled, but it was useless. The drifts swallowed the runners, and the horses labored until they trembled. We turned back, defeated. Our world had shrunk to the boundaries of what we could reach on foot, and even that was growing smaller by the day. The cold did strange things to time. Hours could stretch endlessly when the wind raged, each minute counted by the tick of the stove's expansion and the creak of the cabin walls. Then suddenly a week would be gone, marked only by the small, grim tally of losses: another animal dead, another barrel of feed emptied. I stopped thinking of the winter in months. I thought only in storms. One afternoon, when the sky briefly cleared, I climbed the small rise behind the cabin. From there, I could see miles of white in every direction, no movement, no sound but the whisper of the wind. It struck me then how utterly alone we were in this vast, frozen world. The prairie, which in summer rolled like a golden sea alive with the hum of insects and the dart of birds, was now a graveyard of snow, and yet life clung stubbornly to its thread. The cattle still rose each morning to feed. The stove still burned, the children still laughed sometimes, their small games a defiance against the cold. Even Thomas, gaunt and weathered, came by to share what little news there was. In those moments I understood that survival was not just about hay and shelter and firewood. It was about refusing to yield to the winter's emptiness, but the storms kept coming, each one heavier, colder, more merciless than the last. And though I worked, shoveled, fed, repaired, and endured, I could not shake the feeling that the season had set its eyes upon us and would not look away until it had taken all it wanted. It was near the end of January when I began to realize how much the winter was reshaping me, not just in body, with its weight of work and frost and strain, but in the slow, relentless carving it did to the mind. There was no escaping it. Even in the small hours when the cabin was quiet save for the low breathing of the children, the winter was still there. It pressed in at the windows, whispered against the roof, moved like a pale ghost in the moonlight. That morning, the cold had a sharper edge than usual. My breath hung in the air inside the cabin, coiling in faint, icy ribbons. The stove's heat didn't seem to touch the corners of the room. Anna was bent over the table, kneading bread dough with a slow, steady rhythm. Her hair pulled back, face pale in the thin light. She didn't look up when I came in from feeding the stove, but I saw the tight set of her jaw. I wrapped a scarf around my face and stepped outside. The air seized my lungs like a hand. The snow had crusted overnight, and my boots crunched sharply with each step. The barn loomed ahead, a dim, hulking shadow half wallowed by the whiteness. Inside, the cattle shifted heavily, their breath fogging the cold air. I broke the ice in their water trough with an axe, the sound ringing like steel on stone. One of the younger cows, her coat dusted with frost, pushed forward eagerly to drink, and I found myself murmuring encouragement to her, as though my voice might add warmth to the water. Hay was down to the last few stacked bales against the wall. I counted them automatically, a habit now feeling the familiar twinge of unease. Each day's feeding was a small subtraction from our margin of survival. I knew Thomas was in no better shape. Midday brought a dim sun, pale as an old coin, and I took the chance to walk to his place. The wind had scoured the drifts into hard ridges, making the journey easier in some ways but treacherous in others. When I reached his yard, he was already outside, pitching what little hay he had left to his cattle. His face was gaunter than I remembered, and his hands looked raw, the skin cracked from the cold. "We'll make it through," he said without conviction, as though saying it aloud might force it to be true. I nodded, though in truth neither of us believed the words entirely. We talked a little about repairs, about the possibility of trying for town again if the weather broke. But the sky overhead told a different story, the kind of heavy, waiting gray that promised another storm. The next morning it came, not as a sudden assault like some storms, but as a steady, creeping curtain of snow and wind. The world closed in on itself, the horizon dissolving into the white. I shoveled a path to the barn, fed the cattle, checked the fence line where drifts had piled high enough to make escape a risk. The work kept me warm, but it also deepened my fatigue. Inside the cabin, the children's games had grown quieter. They seemed to sense the change in the air, the way the winter was becoming not just a season but a siege. Clara sat by the stove, carefully sewing scraps of cloth together into a little doll. Matthew watched me with questions he didn't voice. I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand not just the cold, but the thin edge between safety and danger. On the third day of the storm, Thomas appeared at my door again. His face was gray with exhaustion. "Lost another one," he said simply. I didn't ask which. It didn't matter, each loss carried the same weight now. We stood for a moment in the doorway, the snow swirling between us, and I realized how few words were needed anymore. The winter had stripped conversation down to its bare bones. We worked together the next morning to dig out his smaller shed, which had nearly vanished beneath the drifts. Our shovels rang against the frozen layers, breaking through crust after crust. My arms burned, my breath steamed, and the cold gnawed at my toes despite my boots. We stopped only when the shed door was clear enough to open. Inside, it smelled of stale straw and the faint tang of frozen wood. There was no relief in the work, only the satisfaction of necessity met. By early February, the days had begun to lengthen, but only slightly, and without warmth. It was a cruel sort of change, teasing with the suggestion of spring while offering nothing tangible. The wind still ruled the prairie. The cattle moved slower now, their heads hanging, eyes dull. I tried to speak to them as I worked, as though my voice might keep them tethered to the will to endure. That week the cold deepened again, sharper than before. The stove devoured wood at a frightening pace, and I knew the pile outside was shrinking too quickly. Each log was another reminder of how little stood between us and the cold's full reach. I cut more when the weather allowed, swinging the axe until my shoulders throbbed. The rhythm of the work was its own kind of prayer strike, split, gather, stack, and yet, through all of it, there were moments that caught me by surprise. A burst of sunlight breaking through the clouds, setting the snow to glitter like a field of diamonds. The sudden cry of a bird overhead, rare enough now to make me pause, head tilted, listening. The sound of Clara's laughter when Matthew, with all the solemnity of a grown man, presented her with a birthday feast of snow packed into a tin cup. Those moments did not erase the hardship, but they reminded me why the fight mattered. The winter wanted not only to take the body, but to still the spirit, to grind down hope until it lay quiet and cold. Refusing that was the truest form of defiance we had left. Still, as February marched on, the question grew heavier. Would our stores of hay, of wood, of strength hold out long enough? I told myself they would, but the answer was a hope more than a certainty. By mid-February, the prairie was a land of white silence, not the gentle silence of peace, but the heavy, breathless stillness of something holding its ground against time itself. The snow had buried the land so deeply that the shapes of things were no longer what they had been. Fences became low ridges. Barn roofs seemed to grow straight from the snow. The ground was a mystery, a sleeping thing somewhere far beneath the crusted surface. One morning I woke to the sound of something creaking, the timbers of the cabin shifting under the strain of frost. Anna stirred beside me, her face pale in the dim light, the quilt pulled high to her chin. The children slept on, their small bodies curled under the covers like young animals in a den. I dressed in layers, the wool cold against my skin, and stepped out into the morning. The air was still, but the cold had a weight to it that went straight to the lungs. I could hear the faint ticking of the frost as it crept along the boards of the porch. My boots sank deep in the snow, and each step made a muffled crunch, the sound swallowed by the vast whiteness. In the barn, the cattle were restless. One calf stood apart, her head drooping, eyes half shut. I stroked her flank, feeling the sharpness of her ribs beneath the coat. We'd lost too many already. Every weakened animal felt like a warning. I broke the ice in the trough, the shock of it jolting up my arms. The sound carried oddly in the still air, ringing and fading into the emptiness. Later that day, Thomas came by, leaning into the wind with the weariness of a man who'd been walking for years instead of minutes. His scarf was rimed with frost, his beard stiff with ice. He didn't bother to knock, just stepped in, stamping the snow from his boots. "They're starting to drop quicker," he said without preamble, pulling off his gloves. "Don't know how long before." He didn't finish the thought, and I didn't press him to. We sat at the table with coffee that was more hot water than brew, speaking in the shorthand we'd come to use. Weather, hay, the fence on the east side, a coyote sighting near his shed, all of it part of the same question we no longer dared ask aloud. How much longer can this go on? That night the wind returned. It came not as a slow build, but as a sudden, thrashing thing, rattling the cabin walls and hurling loose snow against the glass. The stove crackled and popped, but the heat seemed unable to keep pace with the cold's persistence. The children slept fitfully. I woke often to check the fire, my dreams shallow and tangled with images of snow filling the cabin, burying us where we lay. In the morning, the drifts were taller than I'd seen all winter. The path to the barn was gone. I dug with my shoulders as much as my shovel, the snow giving way reluctantly. It was hours before I reached the barn door, the muscles in my back screaming with the effort. Inside, the animals watched me with a mix of hunger and unease. Their breath made the air thick and damp, but even here the cold had found its way in. I fed them slowly, careful to measure each forkful of hay, calculating in my head how many days I could stretch it. The math was a tightrope. In the evenings, Anna worked by lamplight, her hands busy with mending socks, mittens, old shirts. The steady sound of her needle was a kind of anchor in the storm. Sometimes the children would sit beside her, Matthew reading from the old book of folk tales we kept on the shelf, his voice halting but determined. Clara would listen wide-eyed, clutching the little cloth doll she'd finished the week before. One night Thomas came again, but this time he looked more than just tired. He seemed carved down to the core. "Fence is gone on the north, he said. "Lost 2 already." His voice caught on the last word, and he looked away, pretending to busy himself with his gloves. We went the next morning to see what could be done. The wind had dropped for once, leaving a strange, muffled world behind. The snow stretched smooth and unbroken in every direction, except where the fence should have been. There, the drifts had swallowed it entirely, erasing the line between his pasture and the empty prairie. Somewhere out there, his cattle were wandering, searching for forage that didn't exist. We searched for hours, our boots punching through the crust. Once I thought I saw movement, a dark shape against the horizon, but it was only a low, wind-carved ridge of snow. When we finally found 2 of his missing steers, they were half buried, their bodies stiff and glistening in the cold. We stood for a long moment in silence before covering them as best we could. The days after blurred into each other work, cold, wind, more work. My shoulders ached constantly, my hands raw and split no matter how I wrapped them. I learned to measure the cold not by numbers, but by the way it claimed the body, the stiffening of fingers even inside mittens, the ache deep in the bones of the face, the strange, dizzy fatigue that came when you stood still too long outside. By late February, even the small markers of time began to slip. I would wake and have to think hard about the day of the week. The sun seemed no more than a lighter shade of gray in the sky, its rise and fall more habit than event. Nights were long stretches of tending the stove and listening to the house breathe under the strain. One morning I stepped outside to find the wind had gone completely. The air was so still it felt as though the world were holding its breath. In that eerie calm, the snow gleamed under a thin wash of sunlight. It was beautiful in the way a frozen lake is beautiful, perfect, still, and dangerous. I stood there longer than I should have, letting the pale light soak into me, and for a moment I could almost believe that spring might be out there somewhere, moving toward us through the ice. But the chill in my lungs reminded me how far away that was. Inside, Anna poured coffee into tin mugs, her hands steady despite the tiredness in her face. The children ate quietly, Clara humming a little tune under her breath. It was in these quiet mornings, when nothing had yet gone wrong, that I felt the strongest pull to hold on. There was no reason for it beyond the simple truth that the people I loved were still here, still breathing, still themselves, And so the days went on, the wind coming and going, the snow never truly leaving, the cold settled deep into everything. Survival had become less a matter of grand decisions and more the sum of countless small ones, made over and over. Tend the fire, feed the cattle, mend the fence, break the ice, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. By the first week of March, the prairie's winter felt endless. The wind no longer shocked me. It was as much a part of the land as the low hills and the horizon. It sang in the eaves at night, prowled around the corners of the cabin, and crept under every crack it could find. We had lived with it so long that silence seemed strange, almost unsettling when it came. That morning began quietly. The air was still, and the frost on the windows made tiny cathedrals of ice, each one catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. I stood there for a moment before going outside, my breath clouding in the cold room. The door stuck when I tried to open it, sealed by a thin skin of snow that had drifted against it overnight. I pushed hard, and it gave way with a soft sigh, spilling light and cold into the cabin. Outside, the snow glittered under a pale sun that hovered low, unwilling to rise too far above the horizon. In the barn, the cattle stirred slowly. They were leaner now, their eyes sharper, and they watched me as though weighing whether I would bring enough to satisfy them. The hay was running low, too low. I forked out what I could spare, each flake precious, and made a mental note to speak with Thomas later. When I returned to the cabin, Anna had set the children to their lessons. Clara bent over her slate, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Matthew worked his way through a page of figures. The sound of pencil scratching on slate was steady, soothing in its way. Anna looked up at me, her face shadowed by the worry she didn't speak aloud. Thomas came by last night, she said quietly, glancing toward the children. Said he might have to cull the weaker ones. I nodded. It was no surprise. We all thought about it, even if we didn't say it. A harsh choice, but sometimes mercy took that shape. That afternoon, I walked to Thomas's place. The air was sharp and dry, the snow squeaking under my boots. His barn was darker inside than mine, the smell of animals and hay heavier. He was in the far stall, rubbing the neck of a young cow that stood trembling. She won't last another week, he said without looking at me. I stood there a moment, then reached out to help him. Some jobs were not meant to be done alone. We worked in silence, our breath making small clouds in the cold air. When it was done, he leaned on the pitchfork, his eyes fixed on the ground. Feels wrong. He murmured, but I guess letting her go hungry would feel worse. Back at the cabin that night, Anna set a pot of stew on the stove. The scent filled the room, rich and warm, masking the lingering chill in the walls. We ate quietly, each of us lost in thought. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the windows and moaning through the stovepipe. Later, I sat by the fire with Clara curled against me, her head warm on my chest. She had fallen asleep with her cloth doll in her arms, the faintest smile on her face. I watched the flames shift and crackle, thinking about how the days had become a rhythm of survival. There was comfort in the rhythm, but also danger, a sense that one could lose track of the horizon entirely. The next morning brought the sound of dripping. I thought at first it was a trick of the ear, but stepping outside proved otherwise. Along the edge of the roof, tiny icicles hung, their tips weeping under the weak touch of the sun. It wasn't much, but it was a change, the first sign in months that winter might be loosening its grip. I found myself listening for it all day, the faint drip of meltwater, the occasional crack of ice shifting. Even the air felt different, softer somehow. The wind was still cold, but it lacked the bitter edge it had carried for so long. When I told Anna, she only smiled faintly. "Don't count on it," she said. "March can be cruel." She was right, of course. A day of melting could be followed by a week of storms. Still, I held on to the sound in my mind. That afternoon, Matthew came rushing in from outside, his cheeks red. "Pa, there's birds." I stepped out with him, scanning the sky. At first I saw nothing, but then there they were. A small flock of dark shapes wheeling against the pale blue, their wings catching the light as they turned. I couldn't name the kind, but it didn't matter. They were alive, moving, and not of the winter. The sight stayed with me the rest of the day. Even Thomas, when I told him, managed a faint grin. "Well," he said, "maybe they know something we don't." That evening, the wind died completely, and the sky opened to a depth of stars I hadn't seen since autumn. I stood outside a long while, my breath fogging the air, the snow glowing faintly in the starlight. Somewhere far to the north, faint curtains of green flickered across the horizon, the aurora, pale but steady. It was a reminder that beauty still lived in this frozen world. In the days that followed, the weather played its tricks. A warm day would come, and the snow would sag and darken in patches, the earth showing faintly in the hollows. Then a hard wind from the north would sweep down, erasing every trace of thaw and setting the drifts firm again. Through it all we worked. I patched a weak spot in the barn roof where the snowmelt had started to drip through. Anna boiled down the last of our preserves to stretch them further. The children took turns reading aloud in the evenings, their voices carrying through the small room. And always I watched the sky, looking for signs the slant of the light, the return of clouds that belonged to warmer air. The first full thaw might still be weeks away, but something deep in me believed it was coming. One night, as the stove burned low, I found myself thinking about the seasons. How quickly the land could turn from green to white, from plenty to scarcity. How people, like the prairie grass, bent under the wind but kept their roots deep. Survival was not just in the body, but in the will. By mid-March, more birds appeared. Their calls were strange against the winter silence, thin but insistent. The snow still lay deep, but it no longer felt like a solid wall between us and the world. There was movement in it now, a restless shifting as though it too wanted to be gone. Thomas stopped by one afternoon with news, saw a patch of bare ground out past the creek. He said, "Just a hand's span, but dirt all the same." We both grinned like fools at that. It was nothing in practical terms, but everything in spirit. That night, after the children were asleep, Anna and I sat by the fire in quiet companionship. I told her about the patch of earth, about how it made me think of planting again. She listened, her eyes half closed, and when I finished, she reached for my hand. "Spring always comes," she said simply, and though I knew there were storms yet to face, I chose to believe her. The night air was thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, curling upward from the dying embers of campfires. In the faint light of the moon, the men lay wrapped in their cloaks, sleeping restlessly after the long day's march. Horses stood tethered nearby, their ears twitching at the faintest sound, as if they too sensed the tension lingering in the air. The camp was quiet, yet it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the silence before a storm, heavy, expectant, and edged with dread. A little apart from the others, Rowan sat alone upon a flat stone, staring into the dying glow of his own small fire. His mind was far away, lost in the shadowed corridors of memory. Every flicker of flame brought to his mind another image, the startled eyes of a young boy clutching at his mother's skirts as soldiers tore through the village, the gray hair of a father bending low over a field, never knowing it would be his last harvest, the sharp metallic scent of blood mingling with smoke. These visions were not dreams, but ghosts, the ghosts he carried with him, heavier than his sword. It was not just grief that weighed upon him, it was doubt. Doubt in the path he had chosen, doubt in the cause he had sworn to serve. He had thought himself strong enough to bear the burden, but as the days wore on and the fields behind them grew silent, he could not help but wonder if their struggle was truly worth the cost, and yet turning back was no longer possible. Too many had given their lives for him to waver now. He lifted his eyes to the horizon, where the dark outline of the fortress stood like a jagged shadow against the starlit sky. That was their destination, the heart of their enemy's power. The walls were said to be unbreachable, forged of stone older than the memory of men. Behind them, a tyrant ruled with an iron hand, squeezing life from the land as a miser squeezes coins from a poor man's palm. And tomorrow, Rowan and his companions would stand before those walls, deciding whether they would fight and possibly die, or retreat and watch their cause wither into dust. The faint crunch of footsteps behind him drew his attention. It was Ilara, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders against the night's chill. She moved quietly, but not with the stealth of one hiding. She simply approached with the gentleness of a friend who knew the other's mind was troubled. She lowered herself to sit beside him, the firelight casting soft shadows across her face. "You have not slept," she said softly. It was not a question, but an observation. Rowan gave a tired smile, "And neither have you." She tilted her head slightly. "I could say I came to keep watch, but truthfully, my thoughts would not let me rest." They sat for a moment in silence, the fire popping and crackling between them. At last Ilara spoke again, her voice low. "Do you ever wonder if the gods are watching us? If they see the suffering, the choices we make, the lives we take?" Rowan did not answer right away. He had asked himself the same question many times. At first, he had believed in divine justice, that every righteous cause was blessed and every wicked act punished, but years of war had eroded that certainty. "If they are watching," he said at last, "I think they remain silent because they want to see what we will do without their hand guiding us." She looked at him, her eyes deep and searching. "And what will you do, Rowan?" He took a slow breath. "What I must." The next day dawned gray and cold. Mist clung to the fields like a shroud, muffling the sound of marching feet. The company moved forward in grim silence, the fortress growing larger with every step until its sheer walls seemed to swallow the sky. As they drew nearer, the air grew heavy with the smell of damp stone and the faint metallic tang of the forges within. The gates were shut, but that was expected. The true test would not be in reaching the fortress, but in finding a way inside. Scouts had reported a sally port along the riverbank, a hidden gate seldom used except by servants and supply wagons. If they could reach it undetected, they might have a chance. By midday they had reached the edge of the river. The water ran swift and dark, the current hissing over the rocks. Here they paused to plan. Rowan crouched beside the others, drawing a rough sketch in the mud with the tip of his dagger. "We'll split into two groups, one to draw their attention along the western wall, the other to slip in here." He tapped the crude mark representing the sally port. The men nodded, though none looked eager. This was a dangerous gamble, one that could end in glory or disaster. Rowan knew it, but there was no other way. They could not storm the front gates without heavy siege engines, and to wait for such weapons would give the enemy time to strengthen their defenses. The choice was simple, even if it was perilous. As evening fell, they moved into position. Rowan's group crept along the riverbank, keeping low among the reeds. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness was their ally. But even so, every step felt like a drumbeat in Rowan's ears, each rustle of grass a whisper that might carry to the enemy's watchmen. Near the sally port they found the gate half, hidden behind a thicket of brambles. Rowan motioned for silence, then approached, pressing his ear against the wood. Faint voices echoed from within, but they were distant, perhaps the guards on the far side of the courtyard. He signaled to his men, and together they worked the hinges loose, moving slowly to keep from making noise. At last the gate shifted open just enough to slip through. One by one, they entered the fortress grounds. The air inside was colder, as if the stone itself held the memory of old sorrows. Shadows clung to the walls, and the distant flicker of torchlight revealed narrow passages between looming towers. They moved like wraiths through the darkness, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the enemy's domain. And yet, as they turned a corner, a shout rang out harsh, sharp, and far too close. They had been seen. The shout ripped through the night like a blade through silk. For an instant, the courtyard seemed to freeze. The flicker of torchlight, the slow drift of mist, the soft shuffle of unseen boots, all caught in that fragile heartbeat between stealth and chaos. Then came the rush of movement, boots pounding stone, voices rising in alarm, the clang of steel being drawn from scabbards. Rowan did not hesitate. His hand went instinctively to the hilt of his sword, the polished steel whispering free as he stepped forward. "Run," he hissed to his men, his voice low but urgent. "We hold them here." The men obeyed without question, darting toward the shadowed passage that would take them deeper into the fortress. Rowan stayed with two others, forming a wall of steel between the alarmed guards and their fleeing companions. The first guard came charging from the darkness, torch in one hand, spear in the other. Rowan met him with a swift, decisive strike, knocking the weapon aside and driving his own blade forward. The man fell with a choked cry, the torch clattering across the stones and casting wild shadows against the fortress walls. More guards poured into the courtyard, their armor clinking like 1,000 tiny bells. The clash of steel against steel shattered the night. Rowan moved with grim precision, his blade singing with each strike, each parry. Around him, his companions fought just as fiercely, their faces hard in the shifting firelight. Yet for every guard they felled, another seemed to take his place. It was only a matter of time before sheer numbers would overwhelm them. Somewhere deep within the fortress, a horn sounded a long, low note that carried with it the weight of inevitability. It meant the entire garrison was waking, and soon the narrow passages would be flooded with enemy soldiers. Rowan knew they could not hold the courtyard for long. "Fall back," he called, and together they retreated through the twisting corridors, moving quickly but with measured steps. Their boots slapped against the cold stone floors, the echoes chasing them like hounds on a scent. At last they found themselves in a wide hall lined with faded banners, their colors dulled by years of dust and smoke. This was no longer the outer fortress they had crossed into its heart. The walls here whispered of old battles, of victories won and lost long before Rowan's time. But they had no time to linger. The enemy was behind them, and somewhere ahead lay the tyrant they had come to unseat. They pushed onward until they reached a great door of oak bound in iron, its surface carved with strange runes. Rowan pressed his ear against it. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. He gave a sharp nod, and together they heaved the door open. Inside, the air was thick with incense, heavy and cloying. Tall candles burned in iron sconces, their light dancing across the chamber's vaulted ceiling. At the far end stood a dais, and upon it the throne. The man who sat upon it was not the monstrous giant Rowan had imagined. He was lean, almost frail, his face lined with the marks of age and worry. But his eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy, revealed the truth. This was a man who had ruled not through strength of arms, but through the strength of fear. "You've come far," the tyrant said, his voice smooth as polished steel. "But you've come too late." Rowan stepped forward, his blade lowered but ready. "We've come just in time," he replied, the tyrant's lips curved into a small smile. "You think killing me will save your people. You think it will end their suffering. You're a fool. Another will take my place. Another will wear this crown." "Perhaps," Rowan said, "but not tonight." The fight was swift but fierce. The tyrant moved with surprising agility, his own blade flashing in the candlelight. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, which, Rowan knew, made him dangerous. Yet Rowan's purpose was unshakable, his strikes guided by years of pain, loss, and an unyielding sense of justice. At last, with a final decisive blow, Rowan's sword found its mark. The tyrant fell back against the throne, his crown slipping from his head and clattering across the stone floor. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint hiss of candles burning. Rowan stood over him, chest heaving. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the quiet, heavy knowledge that the work was not yet done. He turned to his companions. "We hold the gates. We end this tonight." They moved quickly, securing the fortress against the remaining loyalists. The sounds of fighting still echoed in the outer courtyards, but as dawn's first light broke over the walls, the cries began to fade. One by one, the enemy laid down their arms. When at last the gates swung open, the people of the surrounding lands streamed inside. They came cautiously at first, unsure if this was truly freedom or another cruel trick. But when they saw Rowan standing where the tyrant had once sat, sword lowered and hands open, a murmur spread through the crowd. It grew into a roar not of anger, but of hope. Rowan looked out over them and felt the weight of what had passed and of what was still to come. He knew that their fight was not over, that peace would be fragile, that wounds would take years to heal. But for this moment, at least, they had won something worth keeping. The morning sun climbed higher, bathing the fortress in gold, and for the first time in many years, its gates stood open to the people it was meant to protect.